But we have a good representation of people throughout the country here. And Paris, Germany.
Yeah, I'm from the bar, ain't coming back down. Starting at the tip of my toes, feel it in my head and my clothes. Oh, Lord, ain't nothing holding me back, so I don't gotta heal the spot. No more. Play it loud when I walk in the door. I got the pedal.
Somebody coming in from India, I think people from the UK.
Yeah, it's time to let them know. Yeah, it's time to let them know. So let's go.
Is anybody else having issues with sound?
I know you're feeling it now. Come on and move to the sound. Keep it going, keep it going. Turn it.
All right. It's 3 minutes after the hour here. We're going to go ahead and get started. So thank you again, everyone, for joining. We're excited to have you here today and share some wonderful information with you that I hope you'll find extremely helpful as you're setting up your platform and getting ready to be do any upgrades. So before we get started, of course, we always have the safe harbor slide. So if there's any comments made during this webinar, they are not meant to be promises of future features or capabilities that will be in the platform. So we just have to make that caveat here. And also just want to show you what's going to be on the agenda today. So we're going to start about talking about ServiceNow configuration, really basic configuration, things that you need to know about. Then we'll talk a little bit about core configuration with users and data. And then we'll move into a discussion about integrations. And maybe your favorite section, we'll talk about gotchas, lessons learned here so that you can make sure you do it right the first time. And then we'll have a little brief section on governance and how you can use that in general, and also to make sure that you are always ready to take upgrades. So I'm sure you'd like to know who's going to be talking to you today. My name is Brita Koch, and I'll be your host today. I've been with ServiceNow almost 15 years, and I was a customer engagement manager for the first 10 years of my career at ServiceNow. So I've been out there with you implementing our product, and I'm looking forward to sharing some of my wisdom, I guess you could say, with you. Betu, do you want to go next?
Hello, welcome everyone. I'm a senior platform architect based in Munich, Germany, and I'm glad I will be attending this webinar. I hope you will enjoy it. Thank you.
Yep, I'll go next. Hi, everyone. I'm Chad Whaley. I'm also a platform architect. I'm based out of Appleton, Wisconsin, so about 30 minutes south of Green Bay. So I'm up here in the frozen tundra. I've been in the ServiceNow ecosystem for almost 14 years now. So I've been a customer, partner, and been an employee for the last 6 years or so. So glad to see everyone today.
Glad to have you. And Gary?
And I'm Gary. Everyone knows me as Junior, though. I've been in the ServiceNow ecosystem for about 12 and a half years now, 9.5 of those with the company. The rest of the time as a customer. So I'm a senior principal platform architect as well, and also certified master architect. Glad to be here and to chat with you guys.
All right. So you can see we have a panel of experts here to go over this information with you today. And before we get started, let's just kind of level set on what the goals are for the webinar today. So obviously we want to give you an overview of how to do your initial setup and set you up for long-term platform success, and then provide you with guidance on these steps and additional best practices, empower you to own your instances confidently, make sure that you feel like you have all the information you need to manage your instances, and also move forward on them with additional features and capabilities. And then obviously to make sure that you can keep your platform upgrade ready, because if you can't upgrade, you can't keep up with all of the innovations that we're putting into the platform. And that's kind of counterintuitive. And so then before we get into the meat of the matter here, we just want to have a poll here first, and just want to see how you are all feeling in your confidence level of setting up the platform. This webinar is intended for net new customers, but I understand there could potentially be some existing customers on here as well. And so the poll is going hot and heavy here. It looks like Somewhat Confident is going to take the lead, but we'll give it a few more moments here because we've got about 50% of people have answered the poll. So keep those answers coming. And we'll take another poll at the end of the webinar, because we're very much hoping that we have moved you from somewhat confident to a higher level, or not very confident to a higher level. And I see some questions coming in here. We weren't going to talk specifically about on-prem, but if you have questions during the webinar, please feel free to drop those into the Q&A, because at the end of the webinar, we will have a time for Q&A. And if we don't get to all the questions, then I gather those up and get answers and create a blog on our community site under discussions, new customer onboarding, and you can find the answers to the questions there. If they get put into the chat, we might miss the question. So really encourage you to use the Q&A function for that. So I think we can end the poll now here. It looks like somewhat confident, around 41% was the leader. And let's see if by the end of the webinar, we can pull that up a little bit. All right, so we're going to go over to our first topic, which is around instance configuration. And I'm going to turn it over to Junior.
Hey guys, so glad to have you guys here. And so I think you've all heard the old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, or if you're outside of the US, maybe it's 28 grams of prevention is worth a half a pound of cure. So a common theme throughout our discussion today is going to be beginning with the end in mind. So it's a lot easier if you start out down the right trajectory to hit your target than it is to have to change your trajectory mid-flight. So that takes a lot more resources, a lot more effort. So if we focus on what success looks like, then we know where to we know how to build our path to get there. So part of that success is going to be initially identifying your key objectives. So what does your leadership want to accomplish? What are your goals for ServiceNow? And before you get to the step that this slide's going to talk about, hopefully you will have already identified those goals and worked with your fabulous account team to obtain all the entitlements and licenses. So whenever you get to this stage here, typically you're going to be working with maybe an implementation partner or ServiceNow to begin the deployment. So there's a few things you want to have handy whenever you start that. On your licensing, you're going to want a list of all the different entitlements you guys have, the different plugins and store apps, et cetera, that you guys are entitled to. You're going to also want to know which email account you're going to use as what I call the sinkhole email account. So basically, during the deployment, you're going to have an email account that the system will direct all of the emails to. You don't really want to be notifying people in your company that they have an incident whenever you're still working on the deployment. So I had one customer once, they failed to create a sinkhole email account, and someone created an incident for the CEO. Well, their email system worked, and he got his email saying he had an incident, and they were not live. So that's a pretty important step. You want to know and already have that email account handy and ready to go so that you guys can enter that in at the beginning. Also, you want to provision an admin account. So whenever you guys are sent your information on your initial login, it'll be admin and some crazy long password. You don't want to use the base admin account to do your initial configurations. You'll just want to use it to create your other admin accounts. And what I'd suggest here is to make sure that the system admins that you end up having that you will end up configuring, make sure that they have at least two accounts. So one is going to be their admin account, and one is going to be their normal account, like if they work support tickets or if they need to use the portal or whatever, they'll use a normal account. So make sure for separation of duties sake and for preventing people from accidentally developing stuff in production. I knew one guy once who developed an entire application in production on accident. So we want to make sure that they have separate accounts between their normal account and their admin account so that we don't mess that up. So the last step on this, the platform box here is going to be making sure that you set up all of your users inside of the Now Support portal. So you want to make sure you define a list of users that you guys are okay with creating support tickets, and try to keep that list to minimal. I've had customers before who have had over 200 people who could create support tickets in the support portal. And the problem there is making sure that the tickets are created, the support cases are created properly and making sure that they're even needed, because we want to make sure that we do proper troubleshooting before we engage support. And if you have, dozens or hundreds of people that can create those cases, you don't have any way to control that. Next is branding. Most companies have standard branding that they want. They have standard color palettes, standard logos. Make sure you have all of that ready, because whenever you do the initial instance configuration and setup, which I'll cover a little bit on the next slide, you want to have all of that stuff handy so that you're not having to go to marketing or whatever group holds the keys to all those different settings. So make sure you have all of that handy. We don't want to waste our time whenever you guys do start engaging your deployment partner, because time is money. And finally, the foundation data. So Sean's got a link, I think he's going to share in the chat, of where it will guide you guys to how to create your import templates. So on all your foundation tables, you want to have your import templates ready for the initial, what I call seeding of the tables. Now, initially, your foundation tables ideally will be being managed by your different integrations. But whenever you first set up, you won't necessarily have those integrations ready to go yet. So you'll need to initially seed a lot of these tables with data. And these import templates, they're very easy to generate. You can fill those out and then import your initial data that you need to be able to proceed. So on the next slide, I'll go ahead and cover a little bit more in detail. So on the left, kind of the layout here, we call this the left nav bar, or the left navigation menu. So if you see the system properties that has the little drop-down arrow beside it, it's highlighted in a bolder white. Those are called menu items, and the things underneath them are modules. So usually we call those applications and modules, but now they're menu items and modules with the terminology there. So under system properties, there are a lot of different modules where you can configure the various system properties. So primarily, I want to focus on the three I have highlighted in red: the basic configuration UI 16, the UI properties, and the email properties. So these are going to contain a lot of the different ways to configure the items that I mentioned on the previous slide. For instance, on the basic configuration UI 16, you can configure the browser tab title, the system time zone, banner image, system date format, your system time format, default colors and themes. I won't read all of these, but there are a lot of other configurations you can do on each of these three items I've called out. But I did want to make sure in the PowerPoint that I did highlight a few of the key things that I see everyone is interested in configuring there. So that's going to be where a lot of your initial configuration will be. And then on the next slide, I will dive into a few tips. So I've done probably, I don't know, between 30 and 50 deployments. So there's a lot of things that you learn as you do different deployments. And a key thing to making sure that you guys are successful is making sure your instance is sized correctly. So before you guys go live, about 10 days before you go live, you're going to want to fill out an instance assessment. So in order to fill out the instance assessment, you're going to need to know your sizing. Now, a lot of the sizing stuff you guys will have already identified during the sales cycle, because you guys will need to know how many licenses you need for the various products. But overall, you're going to need a few key metrics. So one is going to be how many users are you expecting, how many concurrent users specifically. So you may have 100,000 users, but you may only have 10,000 users concurrent. I've seen all variations of those. So which applications are you going live with? How much data will be imported today? And on the instance assessment, they really like to focus on how many gigabytes in data are you going to be importing per day? That may be a little bit more difficult to get, because usually we talk about how many rows of data, but the problem is not all rows are the same size. You may have some tables that have rows that are 3 or 4 times the size of the other tables. How many configuration items are you expecting your CMDB? And how many integrations and integration calls per day are you expecting? So the instance assessment, I've got the KB article number there. If you go to the support portal and look up that KB article, it will give you everything you need to know about how to kick off your instance assessment, which is where it'll ask for the previous questions that I just mentioned, and it'll have a lot of other really good information. Just bear in mind, you need to fill out your instance assessment at least 10 days prior to go live, and they really don't like you to do instance assessments more frequently than each 60 days. There are several different caveats around when to perform an instance assessment, but that KB article will walk you through everything. The final thing I wanted to tie off on is the explicit roles plugin. So this is one that I really like customers to turn on at the beginning of the deployment before they begin any work. The explicit roles plugin is a very important security plugin. And what it's going to do is it's going to make sure that every user and every ACL, which is your access control role, access control list, has at least one role tied to it. The reason why this is so important is if you don't have explicit roles plugin installed and you create an ACL without any roles on it, you're going to potentially grant visibility to data to a lot more users than you plan on. Explicit roles it's a safety net there. It makes sure that you don't create blank ACLs that just open up the floodgates for the data. So it's a lot easier if you do that at the beginning. Once you're already live, it's a little more difficult to turn it on because it's going to go in and it's going to add roles to every ACL and every user, and you may not be ready for that. So that's those are the tips that I wanted to tie off on. And I think next we will transition to Betu.
Thank you, Junior. So this is the part which already Junior a little bit mentioned, and why it's so important. As the name says, it's a foundation data. Quickly a story, I experience a lot with customers. If they don't set up this right, they really struggle afterwards. It's a lot of effort because the whole platform uses this data in every aspect of it. So setting it right from the beginning is really the way to do it. So when we look into it, we have our core data, which is including support of business operation, capabilities for employees and our customers who will going to interact with ServiceNow. This would include the user roles, access permissions, the grouping, etc. The company data itself would mostly include businesses, units, and departments, and locations. Besides that, we would have the product and product modules, which will have software, hardware, applications, services, their specific versions. And if you need to explain them, you are purchasing them, and you want to operate with them, this is the way to do it. And most important about foundation data, someone who knows about the CSDM framework, but already have an idea where I got this view. It's very important that you organize your data on the CSDM framework. It will include categorizing user, foundational process, referential data, and importantly, putting them in the right tables. So basically following the CSDM framework. It's very important that you get them right from the beginning, as I said, and as Junior also said, you can do it through importing the data if you don't have any of their integrations ready. The integration part will be also covered a little bit today. So you have different ways to get the data right from the beginning. So most importantly, why it is so important, again, because the business needs the data for the operation and services team to make their decisions on really important key initiatives. And we will also share a very nice presentation from Now Create, which also gives a good overview about this. Next slide, please. So you have here a little bit some information how you can have your best set up your groups and users. I'm sure some of you are already aware of them. We have an inheritance role and group which you can use. That's how we suggest it. Always set your roles through the groups. Consciously define your roles because they always have license implications, and the privileges also have the authorization. If you don't do it from the beginning, it can cause issues. Who's accessing what? It's also important that you the usage and the impact of the data get it from somewhere trustworthy, or if you are doing it within the instance, again, look into they are set right. And also, most importantly, do have auditing and certification for it. And as I showed in the previous one, every foundation data should have a data steward because you need people taking care of them, having the overview about it. Thank you. Next slide, please. As I said, you need to have information how we get this data. Most of the time, you can have integrations to LDAP. You're getting this information to the instance for login and to get your users in. You would have the authentication, which you will also mention in the next slide. You would have, of course, for easy usage, you would have to put you should do a single sign-on. You would also get your technical resources set up from the beginning, because it will be always challenging to get those information afterwards. And of course, you will need to set the integrations once you are already on the instance and working on it, if you all have defined all of them. Next slide, please. So we have different authentication options. To be aware, all the authentications are the standards we have, and we also add with different versions also additional authentication methods or technologies coming up, or like the adaptive authentication, which is a specific thing helpful to customers to do IP-based or group-based authentications. It's very important that you are really decide from the beginning your authentication mechanism, because you don't want to have people local access to the instance, because you cannot follow up and secure your instance without setting them properly up. The SAML authentication method is, as we already know, it's a standard where you exchange security information between identity providers and service providers. LDAP, we already mentioned, it's about to get the credentials from your LDAP server for easy access. OAuth is also used very commonly. It's very important that you put the OAuth authentication also in your integrations, because if you don't put it from the beginning, I've seen that for years customers use the same username and password, not touch it, and it's a very big security breach if you don't have other means to secure your instance for the integrations. The certificate-based authentications are mostly used with API requests, and you use a certification authority, and with your personal identity and or common access card, you can log into the instance. Most importantly, because of, again, security reasons, you should definitely have a multi-factor authentication. We support several of them, and you can set them on the instance how you would like to. And with the OpenID Connect, you can use really different multi-factor providers available. And as we already talked with authentications and foundation data, most importantly, we also have the integrations. We want to set the integrations up for success from the beginning. And that's why we are transitioning now to chat. Thank you.
Yep. Hey, everyone. So integrations, right? Huge topic, comes up in virtually every conversation. We're not going to get too much into the technical components of integrations today, right? We're not going to talk about protocols or any of that, because we could spend multiple days just on those topics. Instead, today we're going to talk about, kind of what's the core landscape of integrations look like in ServiceNow? What are the conversations and considerations you need to make when onboarding a new integration? So when we talk about integrations, typically it falls into one of three primary use cases. There's process integrations, which are usually, very data centric, involves a lot of data transformation and enrichment, very much tied to, a process or actions being taken on records inside the platform. Then we have UI integrations, which, typically don't involve, a lot of data enrichment necessarily. Think of things like stock tickers, company announcements, maps integrations, things of that nature, things that doesn't necessarily live inside the database, on ServiceNow, but are brought up and presented to a user at that appropriate times in order to kind of drive a better user experience as they're working, say through a portal. And then thirdly, we have data integrations, which are very much foundational in nature in a lot of cases. Think of things like user imports, group imports, Things aren't necessarily tied to any one process, but are really, really critical in order to drive workflow across the platform, for a number of other applications. Now, in terms of solutioning for those three use cases, those typically fall into, again, three buckets, right? We have the kind of store and vendor integrations, right? Those are things that are pre-developed, pre-provided, and very much kind of configured almost to an end state, right? There's still always going to be a little bit of configuration needed for these, particularly for account access and kind of tying them to your process. But those are, typically fully supported either by us or by a partner or a third-party vendor that is, providing that particular integration solution. They're oftentimes found on the store, but don't think that the store is the only place. There are some integrations out there that are provided by a third party that the solution set, if you will, is provided on their their own internal support sites. So if you're not finding it on our side, don't forget to check the other side of that integration if it is a third party tool. Secondly, we have integration hub spokes that are part of the integration hub offering. Those, again, very much like our store versions, very kind of pre-packaged, pre-configured, very flexible in terms of building those kind of components of an integration into your workflow. And those are also fully supported by ServiceNow. And thirdly, we have custom integrations, right? And custom integrations are extremely flexible, but they're also extremely risky if done improperly, right? You can let things kind of spiral away from you very quickly and have a certain degree of integration sprawl, where it gets to a point where you really have no idea how many integrations you have now. You have no idea how many accounts have access to use your APIs, and it can get away from you quite quickly. So, in the next couple of slides, we're going to talk about some things that you can do to kind of control that. So the biggest part of all of this, anytime you're evaluating a new integration, is really understand expectations, right? You've got to have some very important conversations, and you've got to know, what the total picture of that integration looks like. It's not just about, am I using, a web service call, or am I doing an LDAP import? It's way beyond that. So the first three things you really need to get into is, who controls integrations or that integration, right? What's going to trigger these transactions to take place? How fast do I need to be able to run these transactions? And how much total capacity do I need, right? How much of this integration activity is going to be taking place within a certain given period of time, which we'll talk about in a minute, but that can vary, right? So in order to kind of get to that level of detail, we really need to focus on kind of three main areas just to get the conversation started, right? The first one is directionality. Directionality is really, really important. It can help you understand, who that owner of action really is at any given time, because, when you're exchanging data, especially both ways, who's the source of truth, who owns certain data elements, that can change, right? It can vary based on, where we are in a particular state of process. It can change based on which data element we're talking about, right? If I have two systems that are integrated with one another, one may be the source of truth for state, while the other may be the source of truth for assignment. Those scenarios can happen. So really understanding not just the directionality part of it, but the ownership of it really helps you get the right controls in place to prevent things like, conflicts in the data exchange, and eliminate a lot of the ambiguity on, where we are in a process when there is an integration at play. The second one is volume. And these next two, volume and frequency and throughput, really, really help paint the picture of that capacity part of those three questions that I brought up. Volume is really important. We need to understand how much data we're exchanging when we talk about an integration. We need to know how that exchange is happening, or how that volume plays out in terms of timescale. Right? If I'm sending 3,000 transactions per day, when I'm solutioning, it's a very different conversation than if I'm sending 3,000 transactions per minute, right? The considerations I need to make are very different. And the other thing to not lose sight of is volume cyclical? If you have an integration that say may exchange or have 30,000 transactions per day, but 40% of those is between 8 and 9 in the morning, and 40% is between 4 and 5 in the evening, and that other 20% is kind of evenly dispersed between those two time periods, Well, now I know that I have a higher amount of demand on me early in the morning and at close of business. So if I have, a reconciliation job or another integration that I'm looking at putting in place, do those overlap with that or with those two high demand time periods, right? Maybe I don't want to run a reconciliation job at the end of the day. Maybe I want to run it a little bit later so that I'm not putting even more demand on my instance, during those peak times for an integration. I think a lot of times we talk about peak volumes when it comes to user context, but we don't necessarily think about those things when it comes to integration activity or things like scheduled jobs. The third one there, frequency and throughput. Again, the frequency of these integrations, right? There's the volume part of it, of how much data I'm exchanging, and then there's how frequently I'm exchanging it, right? Am I doing a job once a day, right? A kind of bulk import in the morning, or is it something that's more kind of tied to a process that's triggered, throughout the day, almost real time? That frequency can have an impact on what's the appropriate solution for that particular integration. And that kind of frequency and volume can be put together to help you understand what that throughput looks like. And again, that throughput can also be cyclical, right? I may be exchanging the same amount of records throughout the day, so the volume is consistent and not cyclical, but the throughput may be, right? I may have a huge influx of transactions in the morning as people come on or come online, and then throughout the day, it's more even. So that's that cyclical nature of frequency and volume will kind of help paint that picture. So if we move to the next slide, all of those questions and all of those conversations help you, kind of lead to answering a couple of key things, right? So efficiency in the integration is really important. You want to make sure you're solving in the right way. So, a scheduled job is not ideal for something that needs to be, near real time. It's not ideal for something that needs to be bidirectional. But on the flip side of that, an API-based integration, a web service integration may not be the best solution for, a large import of say, a data dump of, 100,000 records every day, right? So understanding the dynamics of those conversations we just had with regard to volume and throughput and things like that, help you make sure that you have the right solution in place. Secondly, we need to make sure that we set limits. If we understand what those expectations are, we can use things like transaction quotas and API rate limiting and concepts like that to make sure that we have some boundaries put on the instance. So if an integration does run away from you, you have some level of protection from it. To give you a really good example, I had a customer who had an event management integration, and they were getting somewhere between 10 and 15 events per minute, right? Pretty high volume. But anyone that's on the call who's kind of operated in that kind of monitoring operational help space can tell you there are things that can happen that cause, like an event storm or a message storm. And there would be cases where, a couple of systems would get accidentally put into a debug mode, and now suddenly their volume or their frequency went from 10 to 15 events per minute to 10,000 events per minute. Like it completely just slammed that integration, right? So when those storms happen, if you have API rate limits, if you have transaction quotas in place, boxes or thresholds that you've put in place to prevent those things from impacting your instance, that's a level of protection that's really critical. So if without having those discussions and knowing what those expectations are, it's really hard to figure out what those limits should be and tailor them appropriately. The third piece there is now that you know all of these things, you can track your integrations much more closely, right? You need to almost have, an integration contract, kind of like we have architecture contracts. Have an integrations contract, right? Every integration you should have clearly documented, what it's for, who supports it, right? What's the expectations around volume and throughput, some, everything we just talked about. Document those things and revisit and revise them on a regular basis. If you don't track them and keep everything kind of well governed and controlled, you inevitably will find yourself in a situation where you have integrations doing things that you don't know about, right? Or you've hit a peak amount of volume that you didn't expect because you have integrations doing things that you didn't prepare for. And the last piece I'll leave you with is really understand, right, your retry and recovery model. Set some standards, set some guiding principles, right? Every integration is going to have a different solution for this, but have a guiding principle that no integration is going to make it onto your platform without some of these protections in place. If there's an outage or if there's a degradation in the integration, who is responsible for performing a retry, right? When do you do a retry? Who is responsible for, running the recovery process, right? If I have an import that runs once a day and it fails, who's responsible for rerunning that import? Can it be done automatically? Are there things that need to be staged in the instance before they can rerun it, right? So again, there's no one solution that I can give you for that because every integration is different and they are very tightly coupled oftentimes to the state of the data or the state of the process. But having some guiding principles and having that as a standard that is required for any integration is really important. And with that, I think we're going to start a new poll.
Yes, we are. Thank you, Chad and Betu and Junior for all that great information. So we just kind of want to know, which of these topics has really been the most helpful for you. And boy, they're going in fast and furious here. Yeah, there's looks like integrations is kind of taking the lead here. And sorry, Betu and Junior, but seems like most people had got questions about or concerns about integrations, so that's good.
Oh, it's hard to compete with integrations here, so that's
right.
That's the biggest part of everyone.
Yes. Yali. All right, it looks like the poll has slowed down here a little bit. So yeah, integrations is clearly in the lead with core configuration second and system setup third. So thank you for responding to that, everybody. And then we're going to get on to another topic, which I hope you will find to be of interest. I call it the avoiding gotchas. And so I'll kick this conversation off. What we're talking about here are what are some of the lessons learned from previous deployments that all of us have done, or information that maybe unfortunately ServiceNow doesn't make as prominently available as maybe it should be to help you when you're just getting started. So we kind of want to go through a few of those types of topics. And I'm going to start it off with when you're doing upgrades, it's really easy to think that is a good time to, because you're already messing around in the platform, to bring on another product. Let's say you wanted to bring up CSM or something else. We actually recommend against doing that, because when you're doing an upgrade, we recommend that you really focus in on the upgrade, because you have enough different balls in the air and things to juggle to make sure that the upgrade goes smoothly, and resource usage, that we really recommend that you just keep the upgrade separate, and then you don't have any confusion of, well, was this caused by the new code, or was this caused by the new code that's coming in with the upgraded version of ServiceNow. And obviously we've talked a lot about starting with the end in mind. I think that's been kind of a common theme here. And we've got the data governance here. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in on this one with me, but I've definitely seen customers bring in all the data that they had in their previous system or want to. And
yeah, definitely.
They're going to clean it later, right?
So, yeah, and so a lot of the customers that I've worked with have very old processes. Some of them have 15, 20 plus year old systems that they are replacing with ServiceNow. And a common thread a lot of them want to do is to let's minimize how much stuff we're changing at one time. So by doing that, they want to just lift and shift everything. So let's just take all the processes we've had in the old system and let's just shove them into ServiceNow, not realizing ServiceNow is built on modern processes, and the systems they're using are built on archaic 20 plus year old processes. So I would really encourage you guys, and this is what I tell everyone, in my opinion, the number one most important factor to a successful ServiceNow implementation is organizational change management. And that talks about dealing with how you work with the various stakeholders whenever they have to change how they do their work. So not only are they changing their tools, but they're probably changing the processes. So it's really important here that you establish a program of organizational change management to take you throughout whenever you start your deployment, but also throughout the entire deployment. It's key. It is number one factor that I've
100%.
seen make or break successful deployments. The other thing I would say, and this is going to be something that keeps you guys kind of evergreen, is establishing a program of solid technical governance. So establish your technical best practices, establish governance boards to review changes in code that people are putting in to make sure that they're not violating them. If you have ability to work with ServiceNow on Health Scan, Sprit Scan, work with them on those. If you don't know what those are, we have more, we can get you information on that. But also you can, there's something called Instant Scan. And if you go Google that, it's a pretty cool product where you can kind of put in ways to enforce your technical governance. And then there are several third-party solutions also to help with enforcing technical governance. But with that, starting with the end in mind, it's a lot easier to have a good stable platform if you start out with good practices in mind. So a great example of one of those is making sure that your developers do not push code up that still has a lot of logging enabled. So the logs, in general information, warning, errors, they all go to the same table. And if you're generating 20 million log messages a day, and most of those are just junk that people forgot to comment out, you're not going to be able to find the actual real error messages easily. So that's something that you want to start out at the beginning with a good, healthy practice, making sure that logging is minimal because you want to see the errors. And if you're drowning in just plain old information messages, you're not going to find the error. So those are kind of my two soapbox items would be technical governance and OCM.
And I couldn't agree more on the OCM because, what I see customers do a lot is they kind of go off in the dark behind the curtain and they develop the new process and everything. And then they, unveil it, user acceptance testing. And at that point, they find out all the people that they really should have talked to and all the things that they missed. And so they think they're going to make things go faster by not having more people involved in the beginning, but then it generally creates a problem right before go live. And then also people are generally much more resistant to a new platform or product if they haven't been involved in it in any way and they don't know what's in it for them. And I've seen, that also cause problems. And so my suggestion around that is to really, whoever your biggest critic is of you going to ServiceNow, engage them. Don't be afraid of them, because they will give you spurious feedback for sure, but they'll also give you really good feedback, and you can potentially win that person over to be a champion. And once that person's a champion and they're a vocal person, I mean, you've just won the war right there, right? So
for sure. I mean, it goes down to human nature, right? If someone
yeah.
tells you you have to do something, you're going to instantly be in a negative mindset about that. But if they bring you along with the journey, you feel like you're part of it, you're invested in the success of it then. And whenever you think about your user experience, if your user experience is poor on the system, your users are never going to embrace it fully. So user experience is very key to that. And part of that user experience is bringing, especially your dissenters, along with the journey.
Yeah. Yeah. I do want to keep things, but Chad or Beitu, if you have anything else you want to add here.
Yeah, I mean, I already tried to get a lot of information here because we have a vast variety of colleagues internally who have much experience. So the data governance, I want to empathize with the database footprint, because what happens is, especially auditing, not taking care of your data really has a big issue afterwards, because the service now, most of the tables have already auditing in place, and sometimes it's too much, not much you need. So especially for the tables you use the most, the processes, take care of your auditing. If you don't need it, disable it, because most of the time you won't use them if you don't have a specific process or specific policies behind it or compliance reasons. That's why it's very important to take care of it. What our junior said is also regarding the user experience, it all comes back to the platform health, because the user experience is not just what the user is seeing. using it, it's also the performance behind all the aspects about it, how it works for them, how they experience it at that moment. That all comes to keep your platform healthy and stable, so they can have the best experience, not just from how it looks like. And it's also coming back to the next experience and all the initiatives and innovation ServiceNow is doing to follow them up and keep it up to date for your employees and or customers. So that's also very important. And of course, I will mention it again and again about the core data and foundation data, CSDM. The best part of CSDM is why I love it so much, is the best thing that could happen on the platform, because it embodies all the data, especially the foundation one. It has a rule. Everything needs to follow up with that. So any new product or existing products needs to follow up with the CSDM framework. So it's very important, if you set everything correctly, you will never have an issue in the future. So, and security, of course.
And I think the only thing I'll add there is specifically around archival and destruction of data, right? Archive and destroy rules. We archive for performance and we destroy for database footprint. And so I have a lot of customers who don't do this early on. They wait for the database to get huge and then they try to implement this, and it's very problematic and very challenging. So have this conversation early, and rely on your data retention policies and the definitions of what should be destroyed and at what time. Right? Use the policies themselves to kind of drive this conversation, and don't just make a lot of assumptions. And keep in mind, there are other systems that may have this data. So that doesn't necessarily mean it has to stay inside of ServiceNow. If you have a data lake where all this data is being retained and that complies with your governance policies or your data retention policies, you can probably be more aggressive on destroying that data in ServiceNow to reduce your footprint and your overall cost footprint, right? So, again, we archive in order to ensure performance of the primary tables where people are operating the process, and we destroy to reduce the footprint. And keeping that kind of line of demarcation, if you will, between those two use cases is really important. But what I find is a lot of customers will archive, but they never destroy. And before they know it, their database is, 10, 20 terabytes in size.
Yeah. All right, I want to leave some time for questions, so I want to move on here, and I'll just breeze through the governance section here pretty quickly. We've talked a lot about governance already, but basically it's the framework that you can put in place that gives you the guardrails you need to manage risk, resources, and your strategy and alignment and those sort of things. That's a technical, a formal definition here. In the perfect world, you might have, like a steering board that is setting the strategy for ServiceNow, and then a separate technical board that is managing the technical aspects of some of which we've talked about earlier. And then you would have a demand board that would manage, what people want to do in the platform and where you're going to go next. But for most customers, this is way too much to start with out of the gate. And so I offer a crawl, walk, run approach for this. And so the first thing you really need to nail, and I think the experts here on the line have made this really clear, is to get your technical governance ducks in a row and make sure that you have that managed from the get-go. Because this is one of the, if you don't, this is one of the hardest things to walk back and fix later. And then have a sponsor that supports you with everything that you need to do here to keep that technical governance in place. And then you can start to think more about how you're going to set your strategy for ServiceNow within your IT organization. Because, obviously IT, we typically think about what's happening in IT and how we are going to make those functionalities better. But then you also have to, at some point, move up to the next level, which is embedding ServiceNow in your company strategy overall, because we're not just an ITSM platform anymore. We have many, many products and applications that can help you manage other parts of your business. And because you have this platform and the single database for it, you want to leverage that and build that into your company strategy. So just a few more things about governance, and we'll get to the Q&A. What does governance do? It, identifies the things that you need to manage, particularly things like budget and risk, which sometimes, people think about a little too late after the fact. And then also it gives you a way to manage those items, allocate those resources, set up those project plans, and most importantly, manage your risk. So before we get to the Q&A, let's just take another quick poll here. With the information that we've provided now, where do you feel like your confidence level sits at this point as compared to the beginning of the webinar? And oh, goody, look at that. We've got a lot more coming in on confident than we did. We don't have any not very confidence left, which let's keep it that way. Fingers crossed. It's great to see these responses coming in here fast and furious, and to see that many of you are feeling confident now. So hopefully we've decoded some of the mysteries around setting up ServiceNow for the first time. And it looks like the poll is kind of slowed down here. So we'll go ahead and exit that, and we'll move into our recap slide here, which this is basically a takeaway slide for you that kind of gives you an emphasis on the things, the main ideas that we really wanted to get across today. Don't miss additional webinars coming up next month in April. We'll be having CMDB tips and tricks, and we will be talking about the CSDM. So go ahead and grab this QR code or go out to the community under events and look up live on ServiceNow events, and you will find this in the new customer onboarding section. As promised, we have some links here to some resources that we hope you will find useful after the webinar, as well as a diagram on the CSDM that Betu provided that hopefully will help answer maybe some of those questions that folks were having around the CSDM. So I want to thank you all very much for attending. There will be a survey that goes out after the end of this webinar, and we really hope that you will fill that out and help us to make these webinars better and make sure that we're bringing you the information that you need to be successful on the ServiceNow platform. And there is a YouTube channel where our previous webinars are available on demand. You can also find that on the community, on the events area. And so thank you very much for attending, and wish you all a very great rest of the day. Thanks for coming.